Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. It was October 2017 when I, Mark Wilson, a regular guy with a passion for photography, decided to ditch the city for a bit. The non-stop noise and rush were driving me crazy, and I craved some peace and quiet. Plus, I figured the Appalachian Mountains in fall would be killer for photos. Little did I know this trip would turn into something straight out of a horror movie. A few weeks before heading out, I did my homework and found this sweet little cabin in the middle of nowhere, near a place called Woods End in West Virginia. It was exactly what I was looking for: total isolation, just me and nature. I packed up my old pickup truck and hit the road. The drive was amazing, all those forests blazing with color. Finally, I rolled up to this lonely cabin in the vast wilderness. It was owned by a quiet old dude named Jabedia and his granddaughter, Lily, who lived nearby. They were nice enough, showed me around, and then left me to it. Next day, I grabbed my camera gear and ventured deep into the woods, eager to capture those vibrant fall colors. I was totally lost in the moment, snapping away, when suddenly, snap, I heard branches breaking behind me. Spooked, I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty forest staring back. It was creepy as hell, but I just laughed it off. My sense of humor tends to kick in when I'm uncomfortable. Maybe Bigfoot wants his clothes up, I muttered to myself, chuckling. I kept hiking, but then I noticed these weird markings on the trees, deep, claw-like gashes. It looked like someone had taken a giant razor blade to the bark. They seemed to be leading me deeper into the woods. Looking back, I should have turned around right then and there. Curiosity got the better of me, though. It was becoming crystal clear that something was seriously off, but I just kept going. The sun started to set, casting these long, eerie shadows all around. I started to feel a bit panicky, and figured I should head back to the cabin before it got too dark. But the trees seemed to bend inward, closing in around me, messing with any paths I once knew, making me feel like I was lost in a sea of dead leaves. Then I heard it, a blood-curdling screech that ripped through the evening air. My heart was pounding like a drum as I tried to figure out where the hell that sound was coming from. I stumbled into a clearing, and there it was, a freaking monster. Glowing red eyes, twisted antlers, limbs like gnarled tree branches, and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It towered over everything around it. I froze, completely terrified. All logic flew out the window. The thing started moving towards me, slow and steady, and that's when instinct took over. Adrenaline shot through me like a rocket, and my only thought was, "Gotta get out of here." I frantically looked around for any path that would take me back to the cabin. The creature stalked closer, its twisted limbs moving unnaturally, and this horrible stench filled the air, like something dead was right there. I tried to yell for help, but my throat was tight, refusing to let out a single sound. Out of options, driven by pure terror, I just ran. I sprinted deeper into the darkening forest, hoping I could somehow outrun this nightmare. The woods swallowed me whole. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing and my heart hammering in my chest. The creature was right behind me, though, a terrifying shape appearing and disappearing in my peripheral vision. I was sure this was it. This was how I was going to die. Then I came across a shallow creek. Without a second thought, I jumped in and plunged myself under the water. The freezing water shocked me instantly, but that was the least of my worries. The creature reached the edge of the creek, looming over the water, searching. Time seemed to stretch on forever as it stood there. It paused. Maybe it couldn't figure out where I'd gone. Just when I thought my lungs were going to burst, the creature let out another one of those awful screeches and vanished into the darkness. I surfaced, gasping for air, scared out of my mind but still alive. After that close call, I kept moving, using what little light was left to try and find my way. Eventually, by some miracle, I stumbled back to the cabin. There, I saw my buddies, Mike, Ben, and Chris, all gathered around a fire pit, laughing and joking like nothing was wrong. I couldn't believe it. How could they be so normal after what I'd just been through? I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. They rushed over, their faces shifting to concern when they saw me. "Dude, what happened to you?" Mike asked, but I couldn't even form a coherent sentence. All that came out were choked sobs. We left the cabin soon after, not even waiting for dawn. We sped back to civilization, but the image of that monstrous creature, its sinister eyes, wouldn't leave my head. Once we were safe, I told them the whole story. A heavy silence fell over us. We felt sick, knowing we had walked right into something incredibly dangerous. We called the local cops and told them everything. They strongly urged us not to go back looking for answers. It became pretty clear that we weren't the first poor souls to run into that thing in the woods. We lost something out there, maybe some innocent part of ourselves. The memory of it all, the guilt, the helplessness, it's a bitter taste that won't go away. We made a pact that day, a promise born from that terrible experience. We'd never be that vulnerable again. We'd never stray beyond where humans are supposed to be, and we haven't. We stick together now, always watching out for each other. Always aware that there are things out there, horrors beyond imagining, that are best left alone. We remember those who weren't as lucky as us, those who crossed paths with that beast before we did. And we honor their memory by staying vigilant, by never forgetting the terror that lurks just beyond the edge of the known. It was March 2009 when I, Mark Collins, finally escaped the city's suffocating grip. I traded in the endless noise and relentless crowds for a beat, up old cabin tucked away deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Peace and quiet. That's all I wanted after that messy divorce. Little did I know, this fresh start was about to get seriously weird. See, I was hell, bent on proving I didn't need anyone. Didn't need my ex-wife, didn't need the city, didn't need anything but myself. Weekdays, I'd work remotely on my laptop, blasting classic rock loud enough to drown out the chirping birds and the wind whistling through the trees. Weekends were for hiking. I'd lose myself in the endless trails, breathing in that crisp mountain air, feeling like a new man. One ridiculously warm afternoon in April, I decided to push my boundaries a little. The sun was turning the forest into this golden wonderland, light filtering through the leaves like something out of a movie. Hours went by. I saw more wildflowers than I could name, hopped over a bunch of little streams, and then, bam, my happy little hike took a dark turn. Nailed to a tree, like some kind of twisted art project, were a bunch of hiking boots. Not just one or two, but like a whole collection. Their laces were tied tight around these rusty old nails, and the boots themselves looked like they'd been through a war zone. Torn, tattered, but clearly belonging to different people. It was creepy as hell. A shiver went down my spine, and I tried to come up with some logical explanation, but my mind kept going to dark places. News travels fast in a small town, and soon I was hearing whispers. Whispers about why those boots were there. They said there was something out there, in the woods. Something that didn't like hikers. At first I was like, yeah, right, whatever. I'm a city boy, remember. I don't believe in backwoods monsters. But the stories, they kept coming, and they started to get to me. I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares that felt way too real. Curiosity, man, it's a killer. One day, I was at this tiny general store near my cabin, and I overheard the old guy who owned it, Mr. Henderson, talking to some local. Mr. Henderson was saying, you know the saying, curiosity killed the cat. But we're not cats. He said most people just shrugged off the stories as myths and went on with their lives. Well, I couldn't just shrug it off. I had to know. So I asked them about it, about the thing that was supposed to be lurking in the mountains. They gave each other this look like, should we tell this city slicker? Then Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, started to spill the beans. She told me every story she'd heard, each one more terrifying than the last. She talked about this huge, dark shadow moving through the trees. A creature, she called it, taller than any man, with long, gangly arms and covered in this thick, matted fur. It made these awful growling noises, sounds that could shake the very trees around it. Some people said they saw it. Others just found the remains of their campsites, ripped to shreds. Always the same thing, though personal belongings scattered, mangled like the owners just vanished. Honestly, I wanted to run back to my cabin and never leave. I told myself I wouldn't go deep into the woods again. But the silence, it was worse than the fear. The walls of my cabin started to feel like a prison. Days turned into weeks. It was like I was going mad slowly with being alone. Finally, one morning in early June, I snapped. I laced up my own damn hiking boots, knowing I was probably an idiot, but I had to get out of there. I walked for hours, praying I wouldn't run into anything. Then, I saw it, that same thicket of trees where I found the boots. It was like a sign, a warning. My heart was hammering in my chest, and then the ground started to shake. It came out of nowhere, this massive thing. It was huge, covered in that same matted, dark fur Mrs. Henderson described. Its arms were impossibly long, and it let out this roar that made my blood run cold. I didn't even think, I just ran. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me up. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the undergrowth. I thought about yelling for help, but who would hear me? And even if they did, Would they get to me in time? It was a dumb thought and not worth thinking about. I came to this clearing with a big rocky outcropping. My only chance was to climb. I scrambled up those rocks, my fingers finding any little hold they could. When I reached the top, I looked down and saw it heading towards the rocks. That's when I got a really good look at it. It was bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, but way skinnier. It had thick black fur, a hunched back, and these eyes. These glowing red eyes that were just locked on me. I had no idea what this thing was, but I knew I didn't want to be anywhere near those teeth or claws. I saw an opportunity and jumped to another rocky ledge across a small gap. I was risking my life here, but what else could I do? I kept moving, looking for anywhere to hide. The thing was bellowing below. Confused by the rocks for a second, it slammed one of its giant arms against a boulder, and, wouldn't you know it, the arm got stuck between two rocks. That was my chance. I ran along the rocky ridge, almost slipping a few times, but I didn't care. I had to get away. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw a cave entrance, hidden behind a fallen tree. I scrambled inside, hoping I had bought myself some time. I found a spot deep in the cave and just waited, listening to the creature's frustrated roars outside. Eventually, the roars faded. It couldn't find the cave entrance. It sniffed around for a while, then, finally, it left. I was safe for now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just gotten lucky. What about all those other people? The ones who left their boots behind. After a long time, when I was sure it was gone, I crawled out of that cave and started walking back towards civilization. When I finally made it back, I called the cops. They went out to investigate, even though I told them it was pointless. They found nothing, of course. Just the same old ripped up gear and some bones. The creature was gone. Part of me wanted answers, wanted to know what that thing was. But another part of me, well, maybe it's better that people don't know. Maybe it's better they think it's just a story. Because the truth is, that thing could still be out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. And that's a thought that will haunt me forever. It was February 2009, and I was about as far from the craziness of New York City as you could get. I was chilling at my family's tiny log cabin way out in the boonies of the Appalachian Mountains. My name's Alex Riley, and let me tell you, what started as a laid-back summer escape turned into a total nightmare. Right when I got there, I met our neighbors, Earl and his sister, Maggie. These two were always good for a laugh. "Alex, you made it," Earl said, grinning. "We're stoked you're here. Last time someone tried to spice things up around here, they nearly froze us all with that ice sculpture they made." The summer days were lazy and slow. We spent our time fishing in the river and exploring the woods. Life in the mountains was super peaceful, until one evening when I started noticing that animals were going missing. A couple of dogs had vanished from nearby properties, and even the deer seemed to have cleared out. The locals, including Earl and Maggie, started whispering about some kind of predator stalking the mountains. I'm not gonna lie, I'm usually the skeptical type, but it was hard to ignore the creepy vibe that settled over our little community. One evening, As the sun was setting, I went outside to take out the trash and saw something weird near the edge of the woods. Bright red streaks were smeared across the tree bark and leaves. My curiosities and an alarm got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it out. As I got closer, shining my flashlight around, I found a deer carcass, all mangled and torn up. What made it seriously messed up was how deliberate it looked. Like, yeah, mountain predators are brutal, but this felt way more sinister. The next morning, after barely sleeping a wink, I told Earl and Maggie what I'd found over breakfast. They were clearly freaked out, and they shared more whispered stories with a sense of urgency that I found unsettling. Over the next few weeks, the predators' attacks got worse. More animals were found brutally mutilated, some of them half-eaten. It was like this thing was just being cruel for the sake of it. The local hunters couldn't find any tracks or anything to indicate what was responsible. Fear kept families indoors, and dogs were no longer left unattended. The sense of dread was almost suffocating. We knew we had to do something to protect our community. Earl, Maggie, and I came up with a plan to track this creature down. They were experienced hunters, so I figured we might actually stand a chance against this thing. Before heading out, we shared a dark chuckle. "Hope you're ready for your close-up, nature photographer," Maggie joked as we grabbed our guns and flashlights. I was actually hoping for a spread in National Geographic. I replied, only half kidding. We headed into the woods as darkness fell, following a trail of carnage that got more gruesome with each step. As we crept deeper into the forest, a heavy silence fell around us. Even the crickets seemed too scared to make a sound. Suddenly, we stumbled into a huge clearing, and that's when we saw it, something straight out of a nightmare. This thing was massive, standing on its hind legs, easily over 7 feet tall. It was covered in thick, black fur, and its claws were gigantic and dripping with this dark, nasty-looking liquid. Its eyes glowed like those creepy yellow embers, burning through the darkness. We froze, rooted to the spot, as this monster turned its gaze on us. We could hear its heavy, ragged breathing, and the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Earl and Maggie exchanged a nervous look before glancing back at me. We all knew we couldn't just stand there. We had to move. I looked around frantically, trying to find a way out, but all I could see were trees, shadows, and darkness. Then I noticed a steep hill to our right that seemed to lead up and out of the clearing. It was our best shot. The creature took a menacing step toward us, and that's all it took. "Whoop the hill," I yelled, and the three of us scrambled in that direction, desperate to get away from that thing. As we reached the top of the hill, I looked back and saw it lumbering after us, closing in way too fast. "Keep going," Maggie shouted. "We can't let it catch us." We raced through the forest, dodging branches and tripping over roots. I realized that yelling for help was pointless. We were deep in the woods, miles from anyone who could help us. There was no one who could hear us scream for help over the pounding of our own hearts. The creature roared behind us, a sound full of rage. I felt a sharp pain in my arm as its claws grazed me. Luckily, it didn't get a good hold. Earl saw what happened and urged me on with a determined nod. "We have to make it," Earl said, panting. If we don't, nobody else stands a chance against this thing. We kept pushing forward until we finally reached the edge of town, where the trees started to thin out. Relief washed over us as we saw the familiar buildings. Do you think it'll follow us into town? Maggie asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, but we need to warn everyone. We can't let that thing hurt anyone else, I replied. The three of us rushed into town, shouting warnings about the danger. The townsfolk quickly gathered, grabbing whatever weapons they could find. Nobody was taking any chances with that horrifying beast lurking nearby. From a distance, we watched the creature emerge from the woods, its dark fur barely visible in the shadows cast by the moonlight. It stood there for a moment, its bloody claws on full display, staring down the group of armed townspeople. In that instant, everyone knew what had to be done. They charged at the creature, weapons drawn, driven by a fierce will to survive and protect their families. Even though we were scared and had no idea what we were really up against, we knew we couldn't let it roam free any longer. The battle was intense, filled with blood and fury. It lasted for hours, stretching through the night. Our community fought tooth and nail against that vicious creature. The ferocity of our resistance made it clear that we wouldn't be toyed with any longer. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the darkness, the brute finally collapsed, defeated. Our town had won, but it came at a heavy cost. We mourned those who lost their lives fighting that vicious predator. They would always be remembered for their bravery. Despite the trauma and loss, we also felt a renewed sense of unity. We had come together to face an unimaginable horror and had come out on top. Deep down, I knew that living through this nightmare would stay with us forever. Nightmares never really go away, but neither do stories of bravery and the strength that comes from people banding together. The nightmare might have ended, but the strength we found within ourselves and the bond that united us will live on. It was January 2014. I was living in this cozy little cabin tucked away in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. The best part about it, the complete and utter isolation. Breathtaking views, peace, and quiet. It was exactly what I needed. My name is Ethan Hayes, but most folks just call me Ethan. So, the day started out like any other. I woke up, made some coffee, and headed out for my usual morning hike. As I'm trekking through the woods, I stumbled across something weird, muddy footprints and these deep claw marks along a rugged path. Now, I'm no stranger to wildlife, but these were different. Way bigger than anything I'd ever seen. I chuckled to myself, picturing Bigfoot stomping around my backyard. I shook it off and kept hiking. Later that evening, my buddy, Dale, swung by. Dale was a local guy, and ever since I'd moved to this neck of the woods a few years back, he'd kind of taken me under his wing. Ethan, Dale said, his usual grin a bit strained. You hear about that fella who went missing last week? Search party found him today. Mauled beyond recognition. No way. Bear attack, I asked, my stomach doing a flip. Dale hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, it wasn't any bear or any animal anyone's ever seen around here. We spent hours that night huddled around mugs of steaming coffee, talking about the poor guy's gruesome fate. Finally, Dale decided to call it a night. A few days later, this unsettling feeling started creeping in. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went back to those weird footprints. I followed them deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone before. And then I saw it, another set of those same bizarre prints. Then, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the silence. It was coming from deep in the forest. I took off running towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. And there it was, my neighbor, Mrs. Gable's old beat-up hatchback. The windshield was shattered, like a spiderweb of glass, with dried blood smeared all over it. I frantically searched around, but there was no sign of Mrs. Gable. No clue what had happened to her. Panic started to set in. I grabbed my walkie-talkie, but all I got was static. We were way out of range. The feeling of isolation hit me like a ton of bricks. Later that night, Dale and I went back to the wrecked car. The sun was long gone, and the forest was pitch black. Our flashlights were useless, barely cutting through the darkness. Mrs. Gable. And that guy. This can't be a coincidence, Dale whispered, his voice trembling. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl. It sent shivers down my spine. Our flashlights finally caught a glimpse of the thing making that terrifying sound. It was huge, covered in spiky fur, standing taller than Mrs. Gable's car. Matted fur hid powerful muscles, and its razor-sharp teeth gleamed in the darkness. "It's not human," Dale stammered. "Ethan, what is that thing?" Terror seized us. We locked eyes, and without a word, we both turned and ran. We sprinted back towards my cabin, the sound of that thing crashing through the underbrush behind us, echoing in our ears. It was gaining on us. We were almost to the cabin, the moonlight illuminating it like a beacon of hope. Suddenly, Dale tripped on a root and went sprawling. I reached down to help him. But then we heard that primal roar again, even closer this time. "There's no time. Keep running, Ethan," Dale yelled, his eyes wide with fear. He knew it was over for him. I had no choice. I ran for the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my cell phone. It felt like forever before I finally managed to dial 911. "We need help. There's an animal or something attacking us in the woods." I screamed into the phone, the creature pounding on the door. Thankfully, the operator understood my frantic plea and dispatched officers and animal control to my location. The wait was agonizing. Each growl, each thud against the door, sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. The cabin shook with the force of the creature's blows. It sounded like the wood was splintering. Finally, the door gave way. Claw marks gouged deep into the wood as it forced its way in. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and blasted the thing in the face with the chemicals. It seemed disoriented, just long enough for me to scramble back. Then lights appeared in the distance. They were here. The professionals approached cautiously, their faces a mixture of disbelief and horror as they took in the scene. Nothing could have prepared them for this. They managed to subdue the creature with tranquilizers after a tense standoff. The officers filled me in later. Apparently, several campers had reported seeing some kind of unknown creature, but the government had dismissed it as misidentified wildlife. Yeah, right. With the news of the government's negligence spreading like wildfire, people were furious. The authorities scrambled for answers, promising to prioritize public safety. But it didn't change the fact that we'd been living in the shadow of this monster. They found Dale's body at dawn, mauled, just like the other guy. It was a sight that would make even the most hardened officers sick to their stomachs. The pain of losing my friend was unbearable, but I had to stay strong. There was nothing I could have done differently. Dale had sacrificed himself so I could live, so I could tell our story. The following weeks were a blur. Life went back to normal, but the forest, once my sanctuary, was now a source of nightmares. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, was a reminder of what happened, of Dale's absence. It was his memory that gave me the strength to keep going. That traumatic experience is a part of me now. It's made me stronger, more appreciative of life. Now, when I walk through the woods or drive those winding roads at night, I think of Dale, his laughter, his courage. It's all etched in my memory. And yeah, every distant growl or rustle in the bushes still makes my heart skip a beat. But I'm also grateful for the lessons I learned that night. Lessons about survival, about facing your deepest fears. Those are lessons I'll carry with me forever. As for the creature, nobody knows what it was. Maybe some undiscovered animal, or maybe something just too cunning for us to understand. But one thing's for sure. It's a haunting reminder that there are things out there, lurking in the darkness, beyond our comprehension, waiting. It was September 2014 when my life took a left turn into crazy town. I'd recently gotten into birdwatching, yeah, I know, not exactly rock and roll, and I was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains, dead set on finding some rare bird that supposedly lived up there. My name's Ben, and back then, I was just your average guy with a weird hobby. One morning, I'm setting up my camera gear by this little stream in the middle of nowhere, when I see something that makes my stomach do a backflip. There's a pile of clothes on the ground, all messed up and half rotten, and a couple of bones, maybe human, maybe not. The smell was enough to make you gag, but here's the weird part: no flies. Not a single one. I tried to brush it off, figuring some hiker lost their stuff and animals got to it. Boy, was I wrong. As the days went by, my little bird-watching trip became less fun and more, I'm gonna get murdered. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but that messed up scene had me on edge. Every little noise in the woods freaked me out. Even when I ran into other hikers or campers, their small talk felt hollow compared to the gruesome stuff I'd seen. On my last day in the Appalachians, totally over the birds and weirded out by everything, I decided to cut my losses and head home early. I'm driving down this narrow dirt road, and my car just dies on me right on a steep hill with zero cell service. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, popping the hood and hoping to find something obvious that I could fix. "Need a hand." The voice came out of nowhere. I jumped, then turned around to see this old guy leaning against a tree, looking like he'd been carved out of the mountain himself. "Yeah," I said, feeling a mix of relief and suspicion. My car just gave up. The old man, who introduced himself as Silas, Came over and we poked around under the hood. Turns out he was a real mountain man, knew the Appalachians like the back of his hand. "It's almost sundown," he said, "and you ain't got no signal. Come on up to my cabin for the night. We'll sort it out in the morning." I was a little hesitant, but hey, what choice did I have? We got to his cabin pretty quick. It was tucked away in the trees, all cozy and inviting, like something out of a fairy tale. A total contrast to the creepy forest around us. That night we sat by the fire, swapping stories. The conversation drifted to weird stuff we'd seen in the wilderness. Silas's face got all serious, and he told me he'd been seeing strange things with the animals around there. For decades, animals disappearing or acting weird, like they were sick or scared. "I can't prove anything," he said, his voice low, "but I think there's something out here, something unnatural." I kind of laughed it off, but then I told him about the bones and clothes I found. As I described it, Silas went pale. "This is worse than I thought," he whispered. That's when we heard the screams. They were coming from somewhere out in the mountains, these awful, tortured cries that sounded both human and animal at the same time. Then, just like that, silence. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I was covered in a cold sweat. Everything felt wrong, like the world was tilted on its axis. Suddenly, the cabin door bursts open. Standing there is this thing. It's huge, all in shadow, with these long, skinny arms and these weird tendrils coming out of its back. It was like a nightmare come to life. "Silas, run," I yelled, but the old man was frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The creature started to move into the cabin, slow and deliberate, like it was enjoying our fear. As the creature got closer, the reality of our situation hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped, cut off from any help. My first thought was to call someone, but who? And even if I could, no one would hear us scream out here. We had to do something, anything, to get away from this monster. The thing was towering over us now, its body all twisted and bony, covered in this rotting flesh. The tendrils from its spine were writhing around, like they were looking for something to grab. Its eyes, deep set and dark, scanned the room, taking us in. It moved with this weird grace, but it was also terrifyingly precise, like it was toying with us. Each step it took towards us was slow, drawn out. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand, and my voice cracked when I yelled at Silas again. "Run. We gotta get out of here." He finally seemed to snap out of it, and together, we made a run for it. We bolted across the cabin, dodging furniture, and trying to avoid those horrible tendrils that kept reaching for us. It was like some kind of insane dance, fueled by pure terror. But somehow, we managed to avoid getting grabbed. We reached the back door, which was locked. Silas fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking like crazy, while I kept an eye on the creature. It lunged at us again just as Silas got the door open. I shoved him through first, then followed, slamming the door behind us. We stumbled out into the moonlit night, bruised but alive. But we couldn't stop, not for a second. The thought of that thing breaking through the door and coming after us kept us moving. "Why didn't you call for help earlier?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath as we ran through the woods. Silas shook his head, a grim look on his face. "Nobody would believe this. Heck, most wouldn't even hear it. We ran, not really knowing where we were going, just trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that abomination. We circled around the mountain, careful not to get lost in the maze of trees and trails. We figured heading back towards town was our best bet, but only after we were sure we were far away from that unholy thing. After what felt like forever, we stumbled onto a hiking trail that we both recognized. With the first light of dawn, we started to hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was almost over. We were close enough to see the town in the distance when Silas stopped to catch his breath. We looked back at the forest, this heavy silence hanging between us. We didn't say it, but we both knew we were lucky to be alive. We were bound together now, allies haunted by the same horror. We didn't dare speak the names of those who might have fallen victim to the creature, afraid that saying them out loud would make it all too real. When we finally got to town, people stared at us. We must have looked like we'd been through a war. We told them some story about getting lost and encountering some wild animals, but we didn't dare tell them the truth. No one would believe us anyway. Silas and I, we got away from that thing in the mountains, but it changed us. We saw something that most people will never see, something that shouldn't even exist. Our lives were spared, but they were also forever marked by that night. We learned that there are some things in this world that you can't explain, things that you can't control or understand. And even though we don't talk about it much anymore, Silas and I will never forget that creature, that nightmare from the woods. Its origins remain a terrifying mystery, a secret the mountains refuse to give up. You ever wonder why a guy like me, who's been through hell and back, would choose to go RV camping alone in the backwoods of Montana? Yeah, me either. But there I was, just trying to escape the mess my life had become. No job worth mentioning, no significant other. Just a beat-up RV and a desire to get lost in the wilderness. I thought some fresh air and solitude might clear my head. Spoiler alert, it didn't. My name's Clay Reynolds. Don't bother trying to Google me, you won't find much. I've always been more of a fade into the background kind of guy. But that's not important right now. What is important is what happened that day I decided to park my RV in the middle of nowhere. The setting was perfect for anyone wanting to disappear for a while. Towering pine trees, the faint sound of a river in the distance, and the kind of silence that presses down on you like a heavy blanket. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I set up camp, pulled out a lawn chair, and cracked open a beer, hoping to numb the constant buzzing in my head. The first sip was cold, refreshing, and for a moment, I thought I could actually relax. It wasn't long before I noticed a strange smell. At first, I thought it might be the RV's plumbing acting up again, but it wasn't that. It was something more metallic. It didn't take long for me to realize that it was blood. My stomach churned, and I felt an uneasy twist in my gut. The smell seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, and my curiosity, stupid as it was, got the better of me. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my wits, which weren't much, to be honest, I ventured into the dense forest. The underbrush was thick, and every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. I pushed on, following the sickening scent, until I stumbled upon a gruesome sight. There, half hidden under a pile of leaves and branches, was a mutilated body. It was so mangled, I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. I wanted to puke, but I managed to hold it together. My first instinct was to run back to the RV and get the hell out of there. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the realization that whoever or whatever did this might still be nearby. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a rustling noise. My flashlight beam danced erratically across the trees. That's when I saw him. A tall man, built like a brick wall, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone. He was standing there, watching me with an expression that was both curious and menacing. "You lost?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. I tried to play it cool. "Just camping nearby. Thought I'd take a walk." He took a step closer, and I could see the glint of a knife in his hand. "You shouldn't be here." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." Without another word, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react. I dodged to the side, feeling the rush of air as his knife sliced through the space where I'd been standing. I didn't wait for him to try again. I took off running, branches slashing at my face and arms as I sprinted back toward the RV. My mind was racing. Who was this guy? Why did he kill that person? And more importantly, how was I going to get out of this alive? I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, getting closer with every second. I burst into the clearing where my RV was parked and dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. For a moment, everything was quiet. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the blood pounding in my ears. Then, the door handle rattled. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer and backed up, ready to defend myself. But the door held, and after a few tense moments, the rattling stopped. I heard his footsteps retreating into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, clutching my knife, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I decided it was time to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, keeping an eye on the tree line the whole time. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. But here's the thing, I couldn't just leave it alone. That body in the woods, that killer. I had to know more. So, instead of heading back to civilization, I drove to the nearest town and found a diner. I figured small town folks might know something about what was going on in their backyard. I struck up a conversation with the waitress, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah. She was suspicious at first, but a few cups of coffee and a generous tip later, she started to open up. "You're not the first to come asking about the woods," she said, leaning on the counter. "People go missing out there all the time. Sheriff doesn't do much about it. Says it's just folks getting lost. But we all know there's something more to it." "Ever heard of a tall guy with a knife?" I asked. She frowned. "That would be Ilya's. Local nutjob. Used to be a logger until he lost his mind. Lives out there now, off the grid. Folks say he's dangerous, but no one's ever been able to prove anything." I thanked her and left the diner, my mind spinning. I couldn't just let this go. I needed to find Elias. confront him and get some answers. Maybe it was stupid, but I felt like I had no choice. This was bigger than just me now. I drove back to the woods, parking my RV a safe distance away this time. I came prepared. I had a map, a compass, and a plan. I was going to find Elias's hideout and figure out what the hell was going on. It took hours of hiking, but eventually, I found a makeshift camp deep in the forest. There was a small cabin, barely more than a shack, and a fire pit that was still smoldering. I approached cautiously, my knife in hand. The door was ajar and I pushed it open, stepping inside. The place was a mess. Empty cans, dirty clothes, and the unmistakable smell of decay. In the corner, I saw a makeshift altar covered in bloodstains and crude carvings. "Looking for me?" Elias's voice sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, but he was already on me, knocking the knife out of my hand and slamming me against the wall. He was strong, stronger than he looked, and his grip was like iron. "You should have stayed away," he growled, his face inches from mine. I struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. He dragged me to the altar and shoved me down, his knife flashing in the dim light. This was it. I was going to die out here, just another victim in the woods. But then, something unexpected happened. There was a loud crack, and Elias crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Standing behind him was Sarah, holding a heavy branch. "You looked like you could use some help," she said with a smirk. I couldn't believe it. "How did you?" She shrugged. "Followed you. Figured you might do something stupid." Looks like I was right. We tied Elias up and called the sheriff. This time, there was no escaping justice. The evidence was all there, the bodies, the blood, the carvings. Elias was taken away, and I finally felt a sense of relief. As for me, I left Montana and never looked back. I'm not sure what I was looking for out there in the woods, but I found something else entirely. Something dark and twisted, but also a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest places, you can find a sliver of light. And that's that. I still don't have my life figured out, but I'm working on it, one step at a time. You know, life has a funny way of reminding you that you're not in control, as much as you'd like to think. Just when I thought I had things all figured out, it decided to throw me a curveball. I remember it vividly, that day when everything changed. It was supposed to be a relaxing RV camping trip to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Little did I know it would become a fight for survival. I've always enjoyed the solitude of nature, the peace and quiet that comes with being far from the city's noise. My RV was parked at a secluded spot in the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. This place was perfect, dense trees, a crystal clear stream nearby, and not a soul in sight. I was looking forward to a week of fishing, hiking, and maybe a bit of reading by the campfire. I set up camp, got my gear ready, and just soaked in the tranquility. The first couple of days were blissful. I caught a few fish, hiked some trails, and even started reading the novel I'd been meaning to get to. The evenings were spent under the stars, with nothing but the sounds of the forest to keep me company. On the third day, things took a strange turn. It was late afternoon, and I was down by the stream trying to catch dinner. That's when I noticed something odd. a metallic glint, coming from the underbrush across the water. Curiosity got the better of me, so I waded through the stream to investigate. Pushing through the dense foliage, I came upon an old rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years. I pulled it out and pried it open with a rock. Inside were some faded photographs, a few letters, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The photos were of a young couple, smiling and happy, clearly taken many decades ago. The letters were love notes, worn and barely legible. The notebook was filled with handwritten entries, detailing their adventures in the very same forest. As I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my eye. It was dated June 17, 1978, and described a disturbing encounter. The man wrote about hearing strange noises at night and feeling like they were being watched. One evening, they saw a figure lurking near their camp. They tried to leave the next morning, but the figure attacked them. The entry stopped abruptly after that. A chill ran down my spine. I shook off the unease, thinking it was just an old story, and decided to head back to camp. By the time I got back, it was getting dark. I built a fire and sat down to cook my catch. As the night deepened, the forest around me seemed to come alive with sounds. It wasn't unusual crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of small animals, but there was something else, a subtle but persistent feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the perimeter of my camp. Nothing. Shaking my head, I dismissed it as paranoia and went back to my fire. That's when I heard a branch snapping close by. I froze, flashlight in hand, and slowly turned towards the sound. The beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady but my heart pounding. No response. I sat back down, more alert now. Minutes felt like hours. Just when I started to relax, there it was again, another snap, even closer. I stood up this time, with my hunting knife in hand, and shone the light into the darkness. Still nothing. The forest was playing tricks on me. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement, just beyond the reach of the light. I aimed the beam in that direction and caught a glimpse of something slipping behind a tree. My pulse quickened. This was no animal. The figure was human. I kept the light trained on the spot and called out again, louder this time, "Show yourself." Silence. The night air grew thick with tension. I backed up to my RV, never taking my eyes off the tree line. Another movement, this time to my left. I swung the light around and saw a man standing there, partially hidden by the shadows. He was tall, with a lean build, and wore tattered clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. "Who are you?" I demanded, knife at the ready. He stepped forward, just enough for me to see his face. It was gaunt, with wild eyes that glinted in the flashlight's beam. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "This is public land," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I have every right to be here. Now, who are you, and what do you want?" His lips curled into a sinister smile. "You found the box, didn't you?" I hesitated, but there was no point in denying it. "Yes." "What of it?" "You should have left it buried," he said, taking another step closer. "No, you're involved." "Involved in what?" I asked, my grip tightening on the knife. In what happened to them? He replied, his voice dripping with menace. In what's been happening here for decades. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted for the RV, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My heart was racing, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Cursing under my breath, I grabbed my keys and started the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. But as the headlights cut through the darkness, I saw him again, standing in front of the RV, blocking my path. His expression was one of cold determination. I honked the horn, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't budge. Desperation clawed at me. I floored the gas pedal, and the RV lurched forward. He moved at the last second, avoiding the impact, but I didn't stop to see where he went. I drove down the narrow, winding road as fast as I could, my hands white, knuckled on the steering wheel. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses to my terror. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see him chasing after me. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the road widened enough for me to turn around. I took a deep breath and decided to head back to the main highway, leaving the campsite behind. The man's words echoed in my mind. You're involved. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right, that I'd stumbled into something far bigger than a simple camping trip. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of those woods and back to civilization. The headlights picked up a sign pointing towards the highway, and I felt a surge of relief. Just as I thought I was safe, something heavy slammed into the side of the RV, sending it skidding off the road. I fought to regain control, but the vehicle tipped and crashed into a ditch. The world spun around me, and everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the RV, dazed and disoriented. Pain shot through my body, and I could taste blood in my mouth. The door was ripped open, and he was there, dragging me out into the cold night air. I tried to fight back, but my limbs felt like lead. You shouldn't have come here, he snarled, throwing me to the ground. You should have left well enough alone. I struggled to my feet, my vision blurry. What do you want from me? I gasped. Justice, he replied, a twisted smile spreading across his face. For them. He pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. I knew I had to act fast. Summoning every ounce of strength, I lunged at him, catching him off guard. We grappled, the knife between us, each trying to gain the upper hand. My survival instincts kicked in, and I managed to wrest the knife from his grip. Without thinking, I drove the blade into his side. He let out a strangled cry and staggered back, clutching the wound. Blood oozed between his fingers as he sank to his knees. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I stumbled back to the RV, started the engine, and drove away, my hands trembling. The drive to the nearest town felt like an eternity. I kept expecting him to reappear, to finish what he'd started, but he didn't. When I finally reached the town, I found a gas station and called the police. They arrived quickly, taking my statement and heading back to the forest to investigate. The aftermath was a blur of questions, police reports, and sleepless nights. They found the man's body where I'd left him, along with the old metal box and its contents. The case was classified as self-defense, and I was free to go. But the experience left a mark on me. I've thought a lot about that trip, about the man and his obsession with the past. Maybe he was right. Maybe I should have left the box buried. But sometimes curiosity gets the better of us. I haven't been back to the Ouachita National Forest since. Maybe one day I will, but not today. For now, I'm content with the memories of a peaceful camping trip that turned into a fight for my life. The small town of Bedford was tucked away deep in the woods. I'd driven my RV, now named Bertha, out there and parked it at this super secluded campsite. Trees towered over me like skyscrapers, their branches thick and heavy, weaving together into this dense canopy that turned the sunlight into this cool, dappled pattern on the ground. I always found my peace in nature, far away from the city's never-ending buzz and drama. And man, had it been a rough few months, losing my job at the factory, the breakup with Sarah. It felt like she took half my soul with her, and then Dad passing away. It all left me feeling like a hollow shell. I needed this escape, this chance to clear my head and reconnect with something real. Something, I don't know, primal. After setting up camp, I decided to check out the area. The forest was huge, with these trails that just seemed to go on forever, winding through the trees. As I walked, I tuned into the sounds of nature all around me, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. It was peaceful, a total 180 from the chaos I'd left behind. The first hint of trouble came when I stumbled on this old, rusted sign, hidden behind some overgrown bushes. It read, Harper's Creek, 2 miles. My curiosity piqued, I followed the overgrown path. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, a product of being alone out here in the middle of nowhere. When I finally reached Harper's Creek, I was blown away. It was gorgeous. The water was crystal clear, flowing over these smooth stones with wildflowers all around. I sat down on a rock by the creek, letting the sound of the water soothe my mind. But that uneasy feeling was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. As dusk started to settle in, I headed back to the campsite. The forest seemed different in the fading light, the shadows stretching and shifting in ways that made me uneasy. I picked up my pace, eager to get back to the safety of Bertha. When I finally got there, I was relieved to see my RV's familiar shape through the trees. I started a fire and cooked up some dinner, trying to shake off the lingering unease. That night, lying in Bertha, I listened to the sounds of the forest. At first, the usual nighttime noises were comforting, but then I heard something strange, a distant, rhythmic thudding. It was faint, almost like someone chopping wood. I told myself it was just another camper somewhere in the forest, but deep down, a voice whispered it was something else. The next morning, I woke up early and decided a hike was in order to clear my mind. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, grabbed my map, and set off on one of the trails I hadn't explored yet. The air was cool and crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of morning. As I walked, the tension from the previous night started to fade away. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, but unlike any I'd ever seen. The tent was ripped to shreds, and the ground was littered with personal belongings. Clothes, a backpack, a sleeping bag, all in disarray, and then I saw a large dark stain on the ground. Blood, fresh blood. Panic surged through me. I wasn't alone out here. Someone else was out here, and they were in trouble. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. I had to find help, and fast. I turned to leave, but then I heard it again. That same rhythmic thudding from the night before, only much closer now. I moved as quietly as I could, following the sound. It led me to a small clearing where I saw a man, his back to me, chopping wood with an axe. He was huge, with wild, unkempt hair and a beard that covered most of his face. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man stopped chopping and turned to face me. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of rage and madness. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, ready to run. But then, he dropped the axe and started towards me. Instinct took over, and I bolted back towards Bertha. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining on me with every step. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I ran faster than I ever had in my life. When I reached the campsite, I jumped into Bertha and locked the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I could hear him outside circling Bertha, muttering to himself. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, my only means of defense. Hours passed, and eventually, the sounds outside stopped. I didn't dare move, just waited for dawn to break. When the first light of morning filtered through the windows, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The man was gone, but the sense of danger lingered. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and drove to the nearest town, my mind racing with the events of the past 24 hours. I went straight to the sheriff's office and reported everything. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Bradley, listened carefully and promised to send a team to investigate. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then, one morning, I got a call from Sheriff Bradley. They had found the man, or what was left of him. His body was discovered deep in the forest, mutilated beyond recognition. It looked like he had been attacked by some kind of animal, but the nature of his injuries was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The news sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder if the man had been a victim of something far more sinister. Maybe the forest held secrets that were best left undiscovered. I sold Bertha and moved to a small apartment in the city, far from the haunting memories of Bedford. Life slowly returned to normal, but the events of that night remained etched in my mind, a stark reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of civilization, waiting in the shadows. It usually started like most weekends did, escaping the city chaos and finding peace in nature's embrace. The familiar hum of the RV engine felt like the start of another chill adventure. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I live for the quiet and the challenge of the great outdoors. Forget office walls and the 9 to 5 grind. I thrive in the wild, where every decision matters. where I feel truly alive. This time I was headed to a little-known spot in Oregon's vast forests, nestled between two mountains. The area promised total isolation and a chance to test my skills. The air was crisp, the sky a deep blue canvas with a few wisps of clouds. The towering pines seemed to welcome me back, their branches whispering secrets on the wind. I found a clearing by a small, pristine lake, perfect for setting up camp. After parking the RV and setting up a basic campsite, I figured I'd explore a bit. I strapped my knife to my belt and slung my rifle over my shoulder, not out of fear, just as a precaution. The wilderness can be unpredictable, you know. By late afternoon, I'd wandered a few miles from camp, marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. Birds sang overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at deer or other wildlife. It was peaceful, almost lulling me into a sense of security. On my way back, though, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, nothing. The forest had fallen eerily silent. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the backdrop of that silence. I scanned my surroundings, senses on high alert. The shadows grew longer as the sun dipped lower, casting a foreboding gloom over the forest. Back at camp, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The crackling flames and the aroma of grilled meat were comforting, but that silence lingered, pressing in on me. I decided to turn in early, hoping sleep would bring some relief. Sometime around midnight, I woke to a noise, faint but distinct. It sounded like a cry, distant but human. I sat up, straining to hear. The cry came again, more desperate this time. Grabbing my flashlight and rifle, I stepped out into the cold night. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the surrounding trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the night. No response. Then the cry came again, closer now, a sound of pure terror. I moved toward it, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't ignore someone in distress. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the cries grew louder. They led me to a small clearing where I found a man, his clothes torn, his face bloodied and frantic. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing at my feet. "They're coming." Before I could even ask who they were, a movement caught my eye. Emerging from the trees were three men, their faces hidden by balaclavas. Their intentions were clear. They were armed, their postures menacing. "Jet back to the RV," I ordered the man, lifting him to his feet. He was weak, stumbling, but fear propelled him forward. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to deter our pursuers. It didn't work. We ran through the forest, adrenaline masking our fatigue. The RV was our only hope. As we neared the camp, I could hear them closing in, their footsteps heavy and relentless. We made it to the RV, slamming the door shut just as they burst into the clearing. I fumbled for the keys, starting the engine as the RV shook from their attempts to break in. The tires spun in the dirt before finding traction, and we lurched forward, speeding away from the camp. In the rearview mirror, I saw one of them raise a rifle. A shot rang out, shattering the back window. Glass sprayed across the interior, but we were still moving. "Who are they?" I demanded, glancing at the man beside me. He was shaking, clutching his side where blood seeped through his fingers. "Thieves," he managed to say. I stumbled upon their stash. They're hunting me. The drive felt like an eternity. I pushed the RV to its limits, navigating the narrow, winding roads with a singular focus escape. Eventually, the headlights illuminated a small town. Civilization, safety. We pulled into the parking lot of a local diner. The bright neon sign a beacon of hope. I helped the man inside, calling for help. The staff and a few patrons rushed to assist, calling an ambulance and the police. As we waited, the man's story unfolded. His name was Liam Reed, a hiker who had ventured too far off the beaten path. He had discovered a hidden stash of stolen goods. Money, weapons, you name it. Before he could leave, the thieves returned, spotting him. What followed was a desperate chase through the wilderness. The authorities arrived quickly, taking Liam to the hospital and securing the area. I gave my statement, recounting the night's events in detail. The police assured me they would search the forest for the men, but a nagging doubt lingered. Would they find them? And if they did, would it be enough to stop them? Liam and I stayed in touch over the following weeks. He recovered from his injuries, and the police made progress in their investigation. They found the stash Liam had discovered and identified the men involved. Turns out, they were part of a larger criminal operation using the forest as a hideout for their activities. A few months later, I got a call from Liam. He wanted to return to the forest, to confront his fears and find some closure. I agreed to join him, feeling a strange sense of duty to see this through. We returned to the same spot, the memories of that night still vivid. The forest seemed different now, less menacing, more like a place of healing. We hiked to the clearing where I had found him, standing in silence for a moment. I needed this, Liam said finally, to face it, to move on. I nodded, understanding all too well. We spent the rest of the day exploring, reclaiming the beauty of the place. As the sun set, we made our way back to the RV. A sense of peace settling over us. The events of that night would always be with us, a reminder of the fragility and strength of the human spirit. But we had faced the darkness and come out the other side, forever changed but not broken. It all started out like any other RV camping trip. We set up camp at Crater Lake, nestled in the Cascade Mountains of southern Oregon. I'm Mark, and I needed this getaway bad. After a rough few months dealing with my dad's death, I was hoping for some peace, some fresh air, a chance to clear my head. The lake's crazy blue water, surrounded by those massive cliffs, was supposed to be the perfect medicine. My buddy, Dave, came along. We've been friends since high school, always sharing a love for the outdoors. Dave, with his stocky build and that wild, grizzly beard, looked like he was born in the woods. He's got this booming laugh and a never-ending supply of terrible jokes that can lift you up, even when things get hairy. We got there mid-morning, set up the RV, and figured we'd try our luck fishing. The fish weren't exactly jumping into the boat, but just being out on that calm water, with the trees whispering around us, made up for it. Around noon, this guy shows up near our campsite. Tall, lean, with a face that's seen some miles and eyes that looked kind of empty. He introduces himself as Rick, said he was a solo traveler, just passing through. Something about him felt a little off. But hey, we're friendly guys, so we invited him to join us for dinner. That night, sitting around the fire, Rick shared stories about his travels, mostly boring stuff, until he dropped the bomb about the disappearances. People go missing in these woods, he said, his voice barely a whisper over the crackling fire. Hikers, campers, they just vanished, huh? Dave and I exchanged a look. Suddenly, our chill night got a whole lot creepier. You believe in that stuff? Dave asked, trying to sound all casual, but not really pulling it off. Rick just shrugged. Believe what you want, he said. Just thought you should know. Next morning, Rick was gone. No trace of him or his camp. We just figured he was an early bird and shrugged it off. Dave suggested we hike up to the rim of the crater for a killer view of the lake. The trail was steep and rocky as hell, but the view from the top, worth every aching muscle. The lake looked like a giant sapphire someone dropped in the middle of all these rocks. We decided to take a different, less traveled path back down. That's when things started getting weird. About halfway down, we stumbled upon this old campsite. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was tattered clothes, a rusty cooking pot, and a ripped-up backpack scattered around. That creepy feeling from last night came rushing back. Let's head back, I said, feeling uneasy. Dave agreed, but as we turned, we heard a rustle in the bushes. Probably just a deer, Dave said, but even he didn't sound convinced. The rustling got louder, closer. We picked up our pace, glancing over our shoulders like a couple of scared rabbits. The trail twisted through the thick forest, the trees feeling like they were closing in on us. Suddenly, Dave stopped and pointed. There, on the ground, half buried in the dirt, was a human skull. Jesus Christ, I muttered, my heart hammering in my chest. We need to get out of here, Dave said, his face pale as a ghost. We started jogging down the trail, feeling like something was watching us, hunting us. Back at the RV, we locked everything up, our earlier excitement replaced by pure dread. Night fell, and we sat there in tense silence. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the RV door. We froze. Dave grabbed the hunting knife he always carried with him. Who is it? I called out, my voice shaking like a leaf. No answer. The knocks came again, louder this time. Dave motioned for me to stay back and crept towards the door. He yanked it open, knife ready, but there was no one there. Then we heard a crash from the back of the RV. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. Dave ran to the rear window, trying to see through the darkness. I can't see anything, he whispered. I reached for the radio to call for help, but all I got was static. Panic City, we were cut off alone. Another crash, this time from the roof. Footsteps, slow and heavy, echoed above us. We need to get out of here, Dave said, his voice trembling. We grabbed our gear and cautiously opened the door, scanning the area. The forest was silent, too silent. We made a run for it, heading towards the main road. Halfway there, Dave tripped and fell with a grunt. I turned to help him up, and that's when I saw the blood. A deep gash ran down his leg, fresh and bleeding. Keep going, he urged. Don't stop. But there was no way I was leaving him behind. We limped through the woods, every step a struggle, feeling like we were being hunted. We heard footsteps behind us, quickening to match our pace. We broke through the trees and onto the road, but there was no help in sight. Then I spotted a cabin in the distance, lights on. We made a beeline for it, banging on the door like crazy. An elderly man answered, his eyes wide with shock at our ragged state. "Please, help us," I begged. He ushered us in, locking the door behind us. "What happened?" he asked, but we couldn't even explain. All we knew was we weren't safe. He gave us water and some first aid, and we barricaded ourselves inside. Hours crawled by, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The old man, Mr. Peterson, kept a shotgun close, his eyes darting to the windows. "This area isn't safe after dark," he said. "I've heard stories, but never seen anything like this." Just as dawn started to break, we heard it again. The knocks. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. "Mister." Peterson raised his shotgun. "Who's?" he demanded. Silence. Then a voice. "Help me, please." It was Rick. "Don't open it," Dave warned, but Miss Peterson, against his better judgment, unlocked the door. Rick stumbled in, his clothes torn and bruises all over him. "They're coming," he gasped. "They're coming for us." Before we could react, a group of men burst in, armed and looking mean as hell. They grabbed Rick, dragging him out as he screamed for mercy. We tried to fight back, but they were too strong. One of the men, a huge guy with a scar across his face, turned to us. "Stay out of this, and you might live," he snarled. Then, they vanished into the forest, taking Rick with them. We were left in stunned silence. Dave's leg was bleeding badly, and we needed to get him to a hospital. Mr. Peterson offered to drive us, and we made our way back to civilization, leaving the nightmare of the woods behind. The authorities were skeptical of our story, but the evidence was there: Dave's injury, the abandoned campsite, the skull. We had proof, but Rick was never found. Back home, safe in my own bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That whole experience changed me, made me wary. I knew the woods held secrets, dark and dangerous, and somewhere out there, those men were still at large. And Rick, what happened to Rick? It still haunts me to this day. You know that feeling, right? That buzz of excitement when you finally hit the road in your RV after a long, grueling work week. Yeah, that's exactly how I felt cruising up to Raven's Peak, this crazy secluded spot in the Montana wilderness. Now, I'm no newbie to RV camping, but this was my first solo rodeo. My wife, Sarah, and the kids, little Timmy and Chloe, had their own thing going on, so I figured, why not? A little adventure for yours truly. The campsite at Raven's Peak. Dude, it was like straight out of an outdoor magazine. Towering pine trees all around, the sound of a stream gurgling somewhere nearby, and this eerie quietness that made you feel like you were the last person on Earth. I parked my rig, a sweet little number named The Wanderer, in a clearing surrounded by those giant trees. Their branches were all arched over like the roof of some nature cathedral. Setting up was a breeze. Before I knew it, I had a fire crackling away, the familiar snapping sound bringing a sense of comfort as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky all kinds of crazy oranges and purples. I kicked back in my trusty camping chair, cracked open a cold one, and just let the tranquility soak in. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but I gotta admit, there was something about that place that put me a little on edge. Maybe it was just being alone out there, or the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. Still, I brushed it off as the usual jitters of being solo in the wild. A few hours later, I decided to hit the sack. The fire was dying down, and the chill in the air was definitely getting more noticeable. After making sure the wanderer was all locked up tight, I crawled into my bed. The gentle hum of the RV's heater was like a lullaby, and I drifted off to sleep. Then bam, I woke up in the middle of the night to this weird noise, like a rustling sound. At first, I thought it might be a deer or something, but as I listened closer, it was clear that whatever was making that noise was way too close and way too deliberate to be just an animal. My heart started hammering, but I tried to keep it cool, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the noise kept getting louder, moving around the RV, scraping against the metal. I reached for the baseball bat I keep by the bed, call it a precaution, and tiptoed to the door. My palms were sweaty, gripping that bat like it was a lifeline. I felt like I was in one of those cheesy horror movies, but this was no movie, man. This was real. Peeking through the little window, I couldn't see anything but darkness. The moonlight was weak, barely lighting up the clearing. I took a deep breath and decided to step outside, bat at the ready. As soon as I opened the door, the cold air hit me, and my breath puffed out in a white cloud. The rustling stopped dead, leaving this super unsettling silence. I scanned the area, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness, and then I saw it. A shadow, moving real quick between the trees. It was too fast for me to make out any details, but it was definitely human-shaped. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who it could be and what they wanted. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding way braver than I felt. No answer. The shadow seemed to have vanished, leaving me standing there like an idiot, bat in hand, heart going a mile a minute. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep. Yeah, right. That was out of the question now. I sat in the driver's seat, bat across my lap, keeping watch through the windshield. Hours crawled by, and the forest stayed silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as the first hint of dawn started to peek through, I must have dozed off because I jolted awake to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming towards the RV. I grabbed the bat again and moved to the door. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could hear someone breathing, the sound way too close for comfort. My heart was pounding like a drum as I flung the door open, ready to face whoever was out there. Standing before me was this guy, tall and gaunt, with a face that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in weeks. His clothes were filthy, and he had this wild look in his eyes. And in his hand, a hunting knife. The blade glinted menacingly in the early morning light. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just stared at me with those crazy eyes, the knife twitching in his grip. I tightened my hold on the bat, ready to defend myself. The guy took a step forward, and that's when instinct took over. I swung the bat, aiming for his hand, but he was quick. He dodged, and that knife came slashing towards me. I managed to deflect it with the bat, but the force knocked me off balance. The guy lunged again, and this time I wasn't so lucky. The blade sliced across my arm, a sharp pain shooting through me. I swung wildly, catching him on the side of the head. He stumbled back, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. "Stay down," I yelled, adrenaline pumping like crazy. But he wasn't done. He came at me again, even more ferocious this time. We struggled, the bat and knife clashing in this insane dance. He managed to pin me against the side of the RV, the knife pressing dangerously close to my throat. In a desperate move, I brought my knee up into his groin. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to shove him off with all my might. I swung the bat one last time, connecting with his head. He crumpled to the ground, the knife slipping from his hand. I stood there, panting, blood dripping from my arm, staring at the guy's unconscious body. I didn't know if he was dead, and frankly, I didn't care. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I dragged him away from the RV and tied him up with some rope I found in the storage compartment. I wasn't taking any chances. After securing him, I rushed back inside, grabbed my first aid kit, and patched up my arm. It wasn't deep, but it hurt like hell. Once I was bandaged up, I called the local authorities. Reception was spotty, but I managed to get through and explain the situation. They said they'd send someone over ASAP. Meanwhile, I kept a close eye on the guy, who was still out cold. When the sheriff finally arrived, he took one look at the scene and shook his head. "You've had quite a night," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and, I don't know, maybe admiration. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, still in a bit of shock. The sheriff and his deputies took the guy into custody. Turned out, he was a drifter with a history of violence. He'd been living out in the woods, preying on unsuspecting campers. They found evidence of his previous attacks nearby: makeshift graves, bloodstains, and even some of his victims' belongings. It was chilling, to say the least. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the forest, I packed up my things, ready to leave Raven's Peak behind. The sheriff assured me they'd clean up the area and make it safe again, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back. Driving away from that campsite, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and this lingering fear. The wilderness was beautiful, no doubt, but it held dark secrets. I'd always loved the thrill of the outdoors, but this experience had changed something in me. I'd faced danger head on and come out the other side, but at a cost. I decided to head home, eager to see Sarah and the kids, to hold them close. The adventure I'd been looking for had turned into a nightmare. But it was over now. Life would go on, and I'd have one hell of a story to tell, though I doubted anyone would believe it. As I merged onto the highway, leaving the forest behind, I couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror one last time. The trees stood tall and silent, a reminder of the wild, untamed nature of the world. And in that moment, I knew I'd always be looking over my shoulder, just in case. The morning fog was thick, like super thick, hanging over the valleys like some kind of spooky blanket. It gave those Northern California forested hills this weird, dreamy vibe. My RV was parked way out there, miles from any town, in this totally secluded spot. I needed this, Some serious me time, away from the crazy city life and that soul-sucking 9 to 5 grind. It wasn't my first time camping out here, but it was the first time I'd decided to go totally off-grid, away from those packed campgrounds and their noisy neighbors. My name's Ethan Hayes, and let's just say I'm a guy who digs solitude. A lot. Some people might call me a hermit or whatever, but I just like my own company. Peace and quiet, you know. It lets me think, process stuff. And lately I had a ton to process. My little brother Liam had vanished 6 months ago. The cops said it was an accident, that he drowned in the lake near our hometown. But I knew Liam better than anyone. He was a killer swimmer, and cautious as hell. Something stank about the whole thing. I brought my hunting gear, not to actually hunt, but, for peace of mind. It's comforting having a rifle close when you're alone in the woods. I also had my dog, Duke, a German shepherd with a nose for trouble. If anything came near our campsite, Duke would know way before I did. The first day was chill. I set up camp, organized my stuff, and took Duke for long walks through the thick forest. The quiet was exactly what I needed. That night, I sat by the campfire, sipping whiskey and staring into the flames, my mind going back to Liam. I fell asleep with the fire crackling beside me, thinking about him. Next morning, I woke up and Duke was gone. That wasn't like him, not at all. Panic clawed at me as I called out for him, my voice echoing through the silent woods. No answer. Just this creepy stillness that swallowed my shouts. I grabbed my rifle and went after him, following the trail we'd taken the day before. After hours of searching, I found him. He was lying still in a clearing, a nasty gash along his side. My heart was hammering as I got to him, praying he was alive. I knelt beside him and realized he was breathing, but it was shallow, real shallow. I wrapped him in my jacket and carried him back to the RV. I did what I could to clean and patch up the wound, but it was deep. He needed more help than I could give. With Duke resting inside, I decided to check out that clearing again. The blood, the injury, it set off alarm bells in my head. What could have attacked him like that? As I retraced my steps, I noticed something I'd missed in my panic. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, but definitely there, leading deeper into the woods. My heart was racing as I followed them, every sense on high alert. The trail led me to this old, abandoned cabin. It was hidden well, covered in moss and vines, blending right into the forest. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging open, creaking in the wind like something out of a horror movie. I went up to it cautiously, rifle ready, and peeked inside. It was dark and musty inside, smelled like death. As my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, in the middle of the room, was this makeshift altar. It was covered in animal bones, feathers, and other weird stuff that looked like it was part of some ritual. But what really got me was the photo in the center of the altar. Liam's photo. I staggered back, my mind reeling. What was Liam's picture doing here? Who put it there? Questions were flooding my brain, each one more messed up than the last. I took a few steps closer, checking out the altar more. Among the junk, I saw a notebook. The pages were filled with crude drawings and scribbled notes. I flipped through it, and the more I read, the less sense it made. It talked about rituals, sacrifices, and names, some crossed out, some circled. A noise from behind made me spin around, rifle aimed and ready. A guy was standing in the doorway, his face hidden by a hood. He was tall, gaunt, and his clothes were all ripped up. He looked at me with this eerie calm, like he'd been expecting me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through me. The guy didn't answer. He just stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Veer's my brother." I asked, my grip tightening on the rifle. The guy smiled, a cold, creepy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He's gone. Just like you will be soon." I didn't wait for him to make a move. I fired a warning shot into the floor, the sound echoing through the small cabin. "Tell me what happened to Liam," I demanded again. The guy laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "You think a bullet can stop what's already in motion? Your brother was just the beginning. There are others like you searching, but they won't find what they're looking for either." I moved closer, the barrel of my rifle trained on his chest. "I will find out what happened, and if you're responsible, I will make sure you pay." Before I could react, the guy lunged at me, crazy fast. We struggled, the rifle clattering to the floor as we wrestled. He was stronger than he looked, his bony fingers digging into my flesh. I managed to break free, grabbing a nearby piece of wood and swinging it at his head. He fell back, dazed, giving me enough time to grab my rifle again. But he wasn't done. He lunged again, knocking the rifle out of my hands and pinning me to the floor. His face was inches from mine, his breath rank. "You can't stop it," he hissed. "It's already too late." With all the strength I could muster, I shoved him off me and scrambled to my feet. I grabbed the rifle and fired again, this time hitting him in the leg. He collapsed, writhing in pain but still managing to laugh through gritted teeth. "You think this ends with me? You're a fool." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted out of that cabin, my heart pounding, and raced back to the RV. Duke was still there, his breathing a little steadier now. I packed up quick and drove away, my mind racing with what had just happened. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that guy chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. When I finally reached a small town, I went straight to the cops. I told them everything, showed them the notebook I'd taken from the cabin. They listened, looking skeptical but concerned. They promised to investigate, but I could tell they thought I was just another freaked out camper with a wild story. Days passed, and then the news came. The cops had found the cabin, just like I said, but there was no sign of the guy. They found traces of blood in the altar, but nothing for sure to tie it to Liam's disappearance. It was like the guy had vanished into thin air. I left that town with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. I'd stumbled onto something way more sinister than I ever imagined. Liam's disappearance was no accident, and there were others like him. I swore I'd keep searching, find the truth, no matter where it led me. Duke made a full recovery, a reminder of the whole messed up ordeal we'd barely survived. The notebook was being analyzed by the cops, but I didn't have much hope. The guy's words haunted me. You can't stop it. It's already too late. I knew I had to be careful, watch my back. The woods held secrets, dark and dangerous, and I'd only scratched the surface. But I wouldn't give up. I owed it to Liam, to myself, to find the truth and put an end to whatever dark force was lurking out there. As I drove away, the fog lifting to reveal the road ahead, I felt this weird sense of determination. The journey was far from over, but I was ready for whatever came next. I had to be. The sun was setting over the Mojave, painting the sky all these crazy oranges and pinks. The air was finally cooling down, and this whole huge empty desert just got quiet, creepy quiet. My name's Ben Riley, and I'd decided to haul my butt and my RV out here for a week-long camping trip. Needed to get away from the city, you know. The noise, the people, the whole damn rat race. I was hoping to find some peace and quiet out here in the middle of nowhere. I've always been a bit of a lunner, more into books and nature than bars and parties. The city had been grinding me down, the constant buzz and the rush. It was the total opposite of the desert's slow, steady rhythm. I figured this trip would be a chance to hit the reset button. Maybe find a piece of myself I felt like I'd lost in all the chaos back there. I parked my RV in this super remote spot I found on a map, like 50 miles from the nearest town. You could practically feel the isolation, the kind that makes you hyper aware of yourself. After setting up a little campfire and cooking up some dinner, nothing fancy, just some beans and franks, I kicked back in my chair with a cold one, just soaking up the silence. First night was chill. Woke up with the sun, feeling more rested than I had in ages. Spent the morning exploring around my camp. Found some traces of old mining stuff, abandoned and just rotting away. The history of this place was kind of fascinating, you know. Like echoes of all these people who came before, looking for gold or whatever, now just dust in the wind. By afternoon, I decided to head out further. Took my rifle with me just in case. Didn't expect any trouble, but hey, it's the desert. Wild animals and all that. I hiked for hours. The landscape changing real slow, showing these hidden valleys and dried up river beds. As the day went on, I found myself near this old, falling apart building. Looked like it might have been a cabin once, but now it was just a skeleton of wood and rusted metal. I was curious, so I went closer, peeked inside through what was left of the door frame. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in junk. But there were signs someone had lived here a long time ago. Broken furniture, an old stove, and a pile of newspapers. I flipped through the papers, checked the dates, mostly from the late 70s. This place had been abandoned for a while. As I turned to leave, something shiny caught my eye. Under a pile of rubble, I cleared it away and found an old, rusty lockbox. It was heavy, and the lock was toast. I pried it open with my knife, and inside were a bunch of old photos and a diary. The photos were black and white, showed a family, mom, dad, and 2 kids. Their faces were frozen in time, smiling these smiles that just felt weird in this desolate place. The diary, written in this neat, cursive handwriting, talked about their life here, their struggles, their hopes. It painted a picture of a tough life, A family trying to make it in this unforgiving place. One entry, though, really stood out. It was dated October 12th, 1978. It described this guy, a drifter named Silas, who came to their cabin looking for shelter. The writer, probably the dad, said he felt uneasy about this Silas guy, how he acted all weird and watched them with these creepy, hungry eyes. The last entry ended super abruptly with this line that gave me chills. "He's here. God help us." A noise outside snapped me out of it. It was quiet, almost nothing, but in the silence of the desert, it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I grabbed my rifle and stepped out of the cabin, scanning the horizon. The light was fading, and the shadows were getting long, making everything look kind of surreal. Then I saw him, a figure, standing on a ridge about 100 yards away, silhouetted against the dying light. He was tall, and he was just standing there, not moving. I couldn't see his face, but something about him just freaked me out. "He!" I yelled, my voice sounding tiny in the vastness. The figure didn't move. I raised my rifle, aimed it at him. "I'm armed. What do you want?" "Nothing." He just stood there. And this feeling of dread started creeping up on me. I backed away slow, keeping my rifle pointed at him, and made my way back to the RV. Once inside, I locked the door, pulled the blinds shut, trying to calm my racing heart. That night was long and filled with all these unsettling noises, scratches on the side of the RV, whispers in the wind. I barely slept, my mind replaying everything, especially that last, terrifying line from the diary. Next morning, I decided I was out of there. Whatever peace I was looking for was gone. I packed up fast, my eyes darting to the horizon, half expecting to see that guy again. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like the desert's eyes were following me. On my way back to civilization, I stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, hoping to shake off the creepy feeling. The attendant, an old guy with a face like an old leather boot, started chatting as he filled my tank. "Out camping?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Out in the desert." He nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Lot of history out there. See anything interesting?" I hesitated, then decided to tell him a little. "Found an old cabin. Looked like a family lived there once. And I think I saw someone out on a ridge." The attendant's expression changed, a flicker of worry crossing his face. "You be careful out there. Lot of folks go missing in those parts. Always some story about a drifter, a stranger. People talk, but you never know." His words didn't exactly make me feel any better. I paid for the gas and kept driving, the desert now just a distant, haunting memory. Back in the city, life went back to its usual grind, but I couldn't shake the experience. I found myself researching the area, trying to find out more about that family in the photos, the man in the diary. There wasn't much, but enough to piece together a sad story. Missing persons reports, unmarked graves found by hikers, whispers of a ghost town haunted by its past. One night, I was going through some old newspaper clippings when a knock on my door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late. I went to the door carefully, my heart pounding. I opened it, and there he was. A tall guy, standing there, with that same predatory look that seemed to see right through me. He smiled, this chilling, knowing smile. "Ben Riley." he asked, his voice smooth and unsettling. Yeah, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. He handed me an envelope, then turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single photograph, one of the family from the cabin. But this time, there was another figure in the background, almost hidden in the shadows. It was the man from the ridge, the man who had just been at my door. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized the connection. The man from the past was here, in my present. His intentions were unclear, but definitely not good. The desert had followed me home, and whatever started out there was far from over. I knew I couldn't stay in the city. The feeling of being watched, the knowledge that he was out there waiting, it was too much. I packed a bag, grabbed my rifle, and left my apartment, driving through the night with no real plan, just a desperate need to get away. As I drove, the events of the past few days played over and over in my mind: the desert, the cabin, the man. Each piece of the puzzle more terrifying than the last. I didn't know where I was going or what I was gonna do when I got there. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, keep running, and hope that somewhere, somehow, I'd find a way to end this nightmare. And then, the sun rose again, painting the sky in those same oranges and pinks, just like it had in the desert. But this time, the light didn't bring any comfort, just the harsh reality that some shadows can't be outrun, and some nightmares never really end. Life had been a string of crummy jobs, and even worse luck until that day. It's funny, right? How the universe throws you a curveball when you're least expecting it. Here I was, out in the middle of nowhere, trying to catch a break in my RV, parked in some secluded spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd been bouncing around the country, picking up work wherever I could find it, and this was supposed to be my escape from all that crap. My name's Jake Riley, and I've always had a knack for finding trouble. Or maybe it finds me. This trip was supposed to be different, a chance to clear my head and ditch the chaos. But as it turns out, even in the wilderness, trouble can sneak up on you. The day started like any other. I woke up to birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves. The crisp mountain air was a welcome change from the noise and smog of the city. I made some coffee and stepped outside to take in the view. The mountains stretched out as far as the eye could see, a sea of green and blue under a clear sky. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, but in a good way. After breakfast, I decided to hit a trail nearby that promised some killer views. I packed a small bag water, a granola bar, a map, and set off. The trail was well marked, winding through dense forests and open meadows. I lost track of time, my mind wandering to far-off places and distant memories. It must have been around noon when I stumbled upon this cabin. It was old and weathered, half hidden by the trees. Looked like no one had lived there in years. Naturally, I was curious. I approached cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight filtering through the cracks. Inside, the cabin was like a time capsule. There was a rickety wooden table with a few rusty tools scattered on top, a worn-out armchair in one corner, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen action in decades. I was about to leave when something caught my eye, a small, leather-bound notebook lying on the floor. I picked it up, flipped through it, and my curiosity went into overdrive. The notebook belonged to someone named Elias Thorne, and it detailed his life in the cabin. He wrote about living off the land, hunting and fishing, and the occasional trip to the nearest town for supplies. But the last few entries were different. They were filled with paranoid ramblings about being watched, strange noises in the night, and shadows moving just beyond the edge of the forest. The final entry was a scribbled note that simply read, "They're here." A chill ran down my spine. I closed the notebook, stuffed it into my bag, and decided it was time to head back. The hike back to the RV was uneventful, but a sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, just like Elias described. Back at the RV, I tried to forget about it. I cooked a simple dinner and settled in for the evening. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin and the unsettling entries in the notebook. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside. A faint scratching sound, like something was trying to get in. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. I peered out into the darkness but saw nothing. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, a low, whispering voice coming from just outside the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent shivers down my spine. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank, or was there really something out there? I decided to stay put. I locked the door and sat with my back against it, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The whispering continued for what felt like hours, but eventually it faded away. Exhausted and on edge, I finally drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, the sun was shining, and the birds were singing like nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream, but deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, something that had been watching me. I spent the day on high alert, checking around the RV for any signs of disturbance. I found nothing, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. That evening, I decided to build a fire, thinking the light might keep whatever it was at bay. As the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I sat by the fire, the crackling flames providing a small measure of comfort. I thought about leaving, packing up, and heading back to civilization. But something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe stubbornness. Either way, I wasn't ready to give up just yet. It was around midnight when I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The scratching was back, accompanied by that same whispering voice. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it out in front of me, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the whispering and scratching. I took a step closer to the RV, the stick held high, ready to defend myself. That's when I saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the clearing. His clothes were tattered, and his face was hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. "Stay back," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man took a step forward, and I saw his eyes, cold, empty eyes that sent a wave of terror through me. I swung the stick at him, but he dodged it easily. He moved with an unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in an instant. Before I knew it, he was on top of me, his hands around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. I fought back with everything I had, kicking and scratching, but it was no use. His grip was like iron, and I could feel the darkness closing in. Just when I thought it was over, I managed to grab a rock from the ground and smashed it into his head. The man let out a grunt and released his grip, staggering backward. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards the RV. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps growing closer. I reached the RV, threw the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. I locked it and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The man was outside, pounding on the door, shouting incoherently. "Leave me alone," I screamed, but he didn't stop. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and held it out, ready to defend myself if he broke in. The pounding continued for what felt like an eternity, but eventually it stopped. I waited, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. There was silence, and then, slowly, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I stayed up all night, clutching the knife, listening for any sign of movement. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I dared to venture outside. The man was gone, but I knew he could come back at any time. I decided then and there that it was time to leave. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and started the RV. My hands were shaking as I drove away. I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty forest fading into the distance. I still remember the day I realized my life wasn't what it used to be. It wasn't some big, crazy adventure that did it, nah. It was the little things, the moments that just stacked up until they defined who I was. It was a Tuesday, and I'd just kicked off my RV trip, something I'd been looking forward to for ages. I love that freedom, you know. Just me, the open road, and no daily grind to deal with. My name's Rick Hayes, and my buddies all know I'm a sucker for the great outdoors. Life's thrown me some curveballs, sure, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. I decided to park my rig near the Macap River, this super chill spot known for its killer views and quiet vibes. The late spring air was crisp, smelled like wildflowers and freshly cut grass. My RV was tucked away in this little clearing, surrounded by these huge pines that dropped their needles all over the ground, making it like this soft, fragrant carpet. By noon, I was all set up and chowing down on a sandwich, just taking it all in. Everything was peaceful, and so was I. I spent the afternoon fishing, snagged a couple of decent-sized bass that I figured I'd grill up for dinner. As the sun started going down, painting the sky all orange and pink, I got cozy by the fire with a book. That's when I saw him, this guy in the distance. At first, he was just a shadow moving through the trees. But as he got closer, I could make him out. Looked like he was in his mid-30s, kinda rugged, with this intense look on his face. He came towards my campsite, all cautious, like his eyes darting around like he was searching for something or someone. Evening, I called out, trying to sound friendly. Beautiful spot, isn't it? He just nodded, didn't say a word. Kinda creepy, to be honest. He was wearing this beat-up jacket and heavy boots, like he'd been trekking through the woods for a while. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm looking for my brother," he finally said, his voice rough. "We got separated a couple of days ago. Haven't seen anyone else around here," I replied. "You sure he's in this area?" He nodded again. "Yeah, he's around here somewhere. Name's Mike. If you see him, let him know Jake's looking for him." I told him I'd keep an eye out and offered him some food and water, but he turned it down. Then he just disappeared back into the woods. His visit left me feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off. People got lost in the woods all the time, right? It wasn't that weird for them to ask for help. As it got dark, I headed into my RV and locked up. I was ready for a good night's sleep after the long day, but sleep was being a real pain. I kept hearing things, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I kept telling myself it was just animals. Then, around midnight, I heard a definite knock on my RV door. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door, real slow. "Who's there?" I asked. "It's me, Jake. I think I found him." I cracked the door open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Come with me. You need to see this." Even though my gut was screaming at me, I grabbed my jacket and followed him into the woods. We walked in silence, the only sound being our boots crunching on leaves. After what felt like forever, we got to this small clearing. Jake pointed at the ground, and my blood ran cold. There, lying face down in the dirt, was a body. I knelt down, my hands shaking, and checked for a pulse. Nothing. He was dead. His face was all messed up, couldn't even recognize him. "Is this Mike?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded. "What happened to him?" "I don't know. I found him like this," he replied, his voice breaking. "We need to call the cops." We made our way back to my RV, and I dialed 911, hands still shaking. The dispatcher's calm voice was such a weird contrast to the panic I was feeling. I told them where we were and what happened. They said help was on the way. While we waited, Jake and I just sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, we saw the flashing lights of the police cars coming closer. The officers took our statements and roped off the area, treating it like a crime scene. The rest of the night was just a blur of questions and flashing cameras. I felt like I was in someone else's nightmare. By morning, they'd identified the body as Mike, confirming Jake's worst fears. The cops suspected foul play and started their investigation full on. Jake was taken in for more questioning, and I was allowed to stay at a nearby motel. My RV was now part of a crime scene. That peace I felt just 24 hours earlier, gone, replaced by this uneasy feeling that this was far from over. In the following days, the investigation unfolded like some twisted puzzle. Turns out, Jake and Mike were mixed up in some illegal stuff, something I hadn't seen coming. They were part of a smuggling ring, using the woods and campsites as their routes. Mike's death was probably a message from their associates, a warning to Jake. I kept my distance from the investigation, but details leaked out in the news, and from the occasional visits from the detectives, I learned that the smuggling ring was way bigger than anyone thought, dealing not just in drugs, but also weapons and other illegal stuff. The authorities were cracking down hard, using Mike's murder to try and dismantle the whole operation. One evening, about a week after everything went down, I was packing up to head home when I got a surprise visitor. Detective Lopez, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a tough demeanor, knocked on my motel room door. "Mr. Hayes, can we talk?" she asked. "Of course, Detective. What's this about?" "We have reason to believe you might be in danger," she said, her tone serious. "Jake's been cooperating with us, and his associates might not like that. They might see you as a loose end." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you suggest I do?" "We're offering you protection, but we also need your help. We think Mike's murder is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're willing to assist us, we can ensure your safety." It was a lot to take in. I came here for a peaceful camping trip, and now I was tangled up in a criminal investigation. But what choice did I have? I agreed to cooperate, knowing it was the only way to stay safe and maybe, just maybe, make a difference. Over the next few weeks, I worked closely with Detective Lopez and her team. They used me as bait, setting up another camping trip to lure the smugglers out. The operation was risky, but it was our best shot at catching them red-handed. I found myself back in the woods, this time with a team of undercover cops nearby. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. We waited for hours, and I started to think they'd seen through our plan. Just as I was about to call it a night, I heard that damn rustling again. My heart raced as I signaled to the officers, who moved silently into position. A group of men came out of the trees, their faces hard, eyes filled with malice. They were heavily armed, and it was clear they meant business. "Where's Jake?" one of them demanded. "He's not here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wrong answer," the leader snarled, raising his weapon. Before he could pull the trigger, all hell broke loose. The undercover cops sprang into action, taking the smugglers by surprise. Gunfire echoed through the trees, and I dove for cover behind a fallen log. The firefight was intense, but the cops had the upper hand, thanks to their planning and numbers. When the dust settled, the smugglers were cuffed, and the officers secured the area. I came out from my hiding spot, shaken but okay. Detective Lopez walked over to me, a look of relief on her face. "You did good, Rick. We got M," she said, patting my shoulder. "The operation was a success. The smugglers were arrested, and their whole operation was taken down. Jake, in exchange for his cooperation, went into witness protection, hoping to start over somewhere far away from his past. As for me, I went back to my RV, the peaceful campsite now a stark reminder of the craziness that had gone down. I packed up my stuff, ready to leave the woods behind. The peace I'd been looking for was gone, replaced by the memories of that night. But life goes on, right? I went back to my routine, though now I appreciated the ordinary moments a little more. The whole ordeal had changed me, but not in the way you might think. I wasn't having nightmares or anything. Instead, I felt tougher, more determined to live my life to the fullest, despite all the darkness I'd seen. As I drove away from the Macapa River, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The tall pines faded into the distance. The woods held a lot of secrets, some of which I'd uncovered. And while I couldn't forget what happened, I sure as hell wasn't going to let it define me. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee outside my beat, up RV, staring into the nothingness, thinking about my crap luck with hunting lately. The mountains surrounding the campsite were swallowed by this thick, early morning fog, and the world was just starting to yawn and stretch. My name's Finnegan, Finn, Molly, and I'd hauled myself out here to clear my head after hitting a seriously rough patch. You see, losing someone you love, it messes you up, makes you want to bolt to somewhere where the only things that matter are your next meal and just the rhythm of nature. The campsite was way out in the boonies, nestled deep within the San Juan National Forest in Colorado. I'd parked my RV in a clearing that was just far enough from the nearest town to feel truly alone. The area was known for its thick forests, winding trails, and the occasional mountain lion sighting, if you're into that sort of thrill. But honestly, it wasn't the wildlife I was here for. It was the peace and quiet, the feeling of being totally disconnected from the world and all its BS. I'd met a couple of other campers over the past few days. There was this old-timer, Hank, a retired truck driver with a million stories, all of them probably taller than the pines around us. And then there was Clara, an artist, always sketching away at the scenery. They were good people, the kind you could share a beer with but not feel pressured to make small talk. This particular morning, I was gearing up for a solo hunting expedition. My rifle was cleaned and ready, and I had packed enough grub for the day. As I was double-checking my gear, a rustling in the bushes caught my ear. Probably just a rabbit, I thought, but the noise kept going. I stood still, every sense on high alert, waiting for any sign of what was making that sound. And then I saw him. A guy, gaunt and totally disheveled, stumbling out of the underbrush. His clothes were ripped, his face covered in scrapes and dirt. He looked like he'd been through hell and back. I lowered my rifle and cautiously approached him. "Here, you all right?" I called out. The guy looked up, his eyes wild and unfocused. Help me," he muttered before collapsing right there on the ground. I rushed over and checked for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and he had this nasty gash on his leg that looked like it had been made by something sharp, like a hunting knife. I grabbed my first aid kit from the RV and did my best to clean and bandage the wound. He needed a doctor, no doubt, but the nearest hospital was miles away. As I worked, he kept mumbling, mostly nonsense like, "They're after me," and "must hide." I tried to get more out of him, but he just slipped back into unconsciousness. I decided the best thing to do was to bring him into the RV. There I could keep an eye on him until I figured out what to do next. About an hour later, he woke up. He was a bit more with it, but still scared out of his mind. I gave him some water and tried to piece together his story. His name was Caleb. and he'd been hiking with a group of friends when they stumbled upon something they shouldn't have. They killed them. My friends, they're all dead, he whispered, his voice trembling. Who did this? I asked, trying to make sense of his fragmented story. Men. They were dressed like hunters, but they weren't hunting animals. They took us, tied us up. I managed to escape, but the others, they didn't make it. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the kind of danger I had signed up for out here. Did you see where they went? I asked. He shook his head. They're still out there. They'll come for me. They'll come for you too. I knew I had to act fast. If what Caleb said was true, then those men could be a threat to anyone in the area. I decided to head into town and tell the sheriff. I locked Caleb in the RV for his own safety and left a note for Hank and Clara, warning them to be careful. The drive to town was nerve-wracking. Every shadow in the trees seemed to hide some unseen danger. When I finally reached the sheriff's office, I told him everything Caleb had told me. The sheriff, a grizzled old guy named Tom Hardy, listened intently. We've had reports of missing hikers recently, but nothing solid. If what you're saying is true, we need to act fast, he said. Tom and a couple of deputies followed me back to the campsite. By the time we got there, the sun was starting to set, casting long, creepy shadows over the clearing. A feeling of dread washed over me as we approached the RV. Caleb was gone. The door was ajar, and there were signs of a struggle inside: overturned furniture, broken glass. My mind raced. Did they find him? Did he try to run? Tom ordered a search of the area. As we combed through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. We found Caleb about a mile from the campsite. He was hanging from a tree, his lifeless body swaying in the breeze. A crude message was carved into his chest: STIYY. Tom cursed under his breath. Looks like we're dealing with a group of sick bastards. We need to get out of here and call for backup. As we made our way back, we heard a series of gunshots. My heart hammered in my chest as we picked up the pace. When we reached the campsite, we found Hank and Clara's RV riddled with bullets. Hank lay dead near his RV, a pool of blood spreading around him. Clara was nowhere to be found, and Tom radioed for reinforcements, and we hunkered down, waiting for help to arrive. The minutes stretched into hours, and the tension was unbearable. We had no idea how many of them were out there, or when they would strike next. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds: the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote. Every noise set my nerves on edge. We took turns keeping watch, but exhaustion was setting in. Around midnight, we heard footsteps approaching. Tom motioned for silence, and we readied our weapons. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised in surrender. It was Clara, bruised and bleeding, but alive. "They're coming," she gasped. "We have to go now." We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed what we could carry and made a run for the vehicles. As we drove away, I glanced back and saw several men emerging from the forest, their faces hidden by masks. The drive to town was a blur of adrenaline and terror. We reached the sheriff's office just as reinforcements arrived. Tom briefed them on the situation, and they set out to catch those guys. In the aftermath, it turned out that the men were part of some rogue militia group operating in the mountains. They'd been using the forest as a base for their twisted games, preying on unsuspecting hikers and campers. It took several weeks, but they were eventually caught and brought to justice. Clara and I testified at the trial, recounting the horrors we had witnessed. The whole experience left its mark on me, but I refused to let it define me. I still find peace in nature, though I'm definitely more careful about where I set up camp these days. As for the RV, I sold it, bought a small cabin in the mountains instead. I can still enjoy the quiet without the constant reminder of that terrifying time. Looking back, I realize that the wilderness holds both beauty and danger. It's a place where you can find peace, but also where the darkest parts of humanity can surface. And though I carry the scars of that encounter, I also carry the strength to face whatever comes next. The wild is unpredictable, just like life. You never really know what's waiting for you around the bend. You know that feeling when you're on vacation but work, and life still find a way to stress you out. That's where I was last weekend. Decided to get away in the RV, just to find some peace and quiet. My name's Ben, by the way. I've been going through a rough patch recently. The kind that makes you want to run away from everything for a while. I parked the RV at Whispering Pines Campgrounds, a spot deep in the forests of West Virginia. It was one of those places with no cell service and no distractions. Just what I needed. I pulled in around midday, set up camp, and started a fire. The sound of crackling wood was therapeutic, you know. Later that afternoon, I decided to go on a short hike to clear my head. As I walked along the narrow trail, the forest seemed unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I shrugged it off as nature's way of giving me the solitude I craved. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was half hidden by overgrown bushes and looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I approached it. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside it was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and dusty trinkets. It was eerie, but something about it intrigued me. I wandered around, picking up an old photo album on a table. The photos were black and white, showing a family that seemed happy, but there was something off about their smiles. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint rustling sound from one of the rooms. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called out, half hoping no one would answer. Silence. I took a deep breath and walked towards the sound. The door to the room was slightly open, and I nudged it with my foot. Inside, there was nothing but an old rocking chair, moving slightly as if someone had just left it. I decided I'd had enough of the creepy cabin and headed back to my RV. As I walked back through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. That night, as I sat by the campfire, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading to my campsite. My heart raced. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam caught a figure standing, just at the edge of the trees. Tall man with a rugged, unkempt appearance. He was staring right at me. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man stepped forward, his face illuminated by the firelight. "You shouldn't have gone into the cabin," he said in a low, menacing voice. I stood up, holding the flashlight like a weapon. "What's your problem, man?" "It's just an old cabin." His eyes narrowed. "That cabin is cursed. Everyone who goes in there disappears." I laughed nervously. "Nice try. Now get lost." He didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. "You'll see," he said before turning and disappearing into the forest. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was convinced I needed to leave Whispering Pines. I packed up the RV and drove out of there as fast as I could. As I drove, I kept replaying the man's words in my head. "Everyone who goes in there disappears." It was probably just a local trying to scare off tourists, I told myself, but something about his tone, his expression, made me uneasy. I was about 50 miles away from the campsite when I noticed a car tailing me. It was an old, beat-up pickup, and it stayed a consistent distance behind me. My paranoia kicked in, and I decided to take a few random turns to see if it was really following me. It was. I pulled into a gas station, my heart pounding. The pickup pulled in too, parking a few spots away. I got out of the RV and walked into the gas station store, pretending to browse the snacks while keeping an eye on the man in the pickup. He didn't get out of the truck, just sat there watching. I decided to confront him. Maybe it was just a coincidence, and I was overreacting. I walked up to the truck and knocked on the window. The man rolled it down, and I realized it was the same guy from the forest. "What the hell do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled that same twisted smile. "Just making sure you don't disappear," he said. "Look, man, I don't know what your deal is, but leave me alone," I snapped. He chuckled. "You don't get it, do you? You're marked now. You went into the cabin, they'll come for you." I backed away, my mind racing. This guy was clearly insane. I got back into the RV and drove off, not stopping until I reached a crowded town. I needed to be around people, somewhere safe. I found a small motel and checked in, hoping to get some rest and clear my head. But as I lay in bed, the man's words echoed in my mind. "You're marked now. They'll come for you." Just as I was drifting off, there was a loud bang on my door. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. "Who is it?" I called out. "Police. Open up," a voice shouted. I opened the door to find 2 officers standing there, looking serious. "Are you Benjamin Miller? We need to ask you some questions." I nodded, confused and a little relieved. "What's going on?" "There was an incident at Whispering Pines campgrounds," one of the officers said. "A body was found. We need to know if you saw anything unusual." My blood ran cold. "A body? What happened?" The officers exchanged a glance. "We're still investigating, but it looks like foul play. Can you come down to the station and give a statement?" I agreed and followed them to the station. As I sat in the interrogation room, the events of the past day swirled in my mind: the cabin, the man, the threats. What had I gotten myself into? The officers questioned me for hours, asking about every detail of my trip. I told them everything, from the abandoned cabin to the man's threats. They seemed skeptical, but they took my statement and let me go. I returned to the motel, exhausted and paranoid. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, then collapsed onto the bed. I needed to leave this place, to put as much distance between me and Whispering Pines as possible. The next morning, I packed up and hit the road again, driving aimlessly until I found another campground far from Whispering Pines. I parked the RV and tried to relax, but the events of the past few days weighed heavily on my mind. As I sat by the campfire that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept a flashlight and a knife close by just in case. Around midnight, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam caught a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. A tall man with a rugged, unkempt appearance. It was the same man. "Leave me alone," I shouted, brandishing the knife. He stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "You can't escape it, Ben. You're marked. They'll come for you." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He smiled that twisted smile again. "I'm just a messenger. They'll come for you soon enough." I backed away, my mind racing. This guy was clearly insane, but what if he was right? What if there was something out there? Something that wouldn't let me go? I didn't sleep that night, keeping watch until dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up and hit the road again, driving without a destination in mind. I needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever was out there. Days turned into weeks, and I became a nomad, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to be found. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that they were always just one step behind me. Then, one night, as I was parked at a secluded spot in the mountains, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, more deliberate. I grabbed the knife and flashlight, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the RV door. I held my breath, waiting. The door creaked open, and the man stepped inside, his eyes glinting with malice. "It's time, Ben." I lunged at him with the knife, but he was quick. He knocked it out of my hand and pinned me against the wall. "You can't escape," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. I struggled, but he was too strong. As he tightened his grip, I knew this was it. I was marked, and they had finally come for me. In a desperate last attempt, I kicked him hard, sending him stumbling back. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it at his head, knocking him to the ground. I didn't wait to see if he would get up. I ran out of the RV and into the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a clearing. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the trees, and I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to find a way to end this, to break the curse. The next morning, I returned to the RV, weary and exhausted. The man was gone, but the RV was trashed. I knew I couldn't stay there, so I packed up what little I had left and hit the road again. I drove for days, following a vague sense of direction, until I found a small town. I checked into a motel and collapsed onto the bed, hoping for some rest. But that night, the nightmares began. They were vivid and terrifying. filled with images of the man in the cabin. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to find a way to break the curse. I remembered the photo album from the cabin, the family with the off-kilter smiles. Maybe they held the key. I drove back to Whispering Pines, my heart pounding with fear and determination. I parked the RV and made my way to the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, everything was as I had left it: the rocking chair, the musty furniture, the photo album. I opened the album and examined the photos more closely. There was something off about them, something I hadn't noticed before. In each photo, the family's eyes seemed to follow me, their smiles twisted and unnatural. As I flipped through the pages, I found a note tucked in the back. It was old and faded, but I could make out the words, "The cabin is cursed. They took our souls. Beware the messenger. Destroy the album to break the curse." My hands trembled as I read the note. Destroy the album. It seemed too simple, but I had nothing to lose. I grabbed the album and ran outside, throwing it into the campfire. The flames consumed it, turning the photos to ash. As the last of the album burned, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, the curse was broken. I stayed at Whispering Pines that night, waiting to see if the man would return. He never did. The next morning, I packed up and hit the road again, feeling a weight lifted from my shoulders. The feeling of being watched was gone, and I finally felt free. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I could finally move on from the nightmare of Whispering Pines. As I drove away, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that I had survived. I was finally free, and maybe, just maybe, Ben Miller could finally get a good night's sleep.